Hello, I'm pleased to have with me today Rebecca Fischer, who's a collaborative divorce lawyer and divorce mediator in Hollywood, Florida. She serves on a number of boards of directors and committees relating to the collaborative divorce process, and she's been given numerous accolades at the state and the national level for being a top lawyer year over year. Welcome, Rebecca. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Stephanie. It's my pleasure to be here.
As a lawyer and a mom of a child with special needs, Rebecca is here to speak with us today in her perspective about how children with special needs who are going through separation and divorce, who are going through the separation and divorce process, and to help parents to know what to consider as they embark on this journey into raising children in two homes. Okay, so let's get going. As an attorney, what kind of special needs do you see come up in separation and divorce cases?
There are behavioral issues, developmental issues, physical issues, and emotional issues. Parents don't always see issues the same way a psychologist or a physician would, or that their child may fall into the category of having special needs, which often is some of the friction between parents. Do we get a diagnosis or don't we when the issues are behavioral or emotional? Physical, obviously, and developmental are much easier to see and agree that we need a doctor's intervention or involvement in taking care of our child. But those would be the four categories.
So can you give us some examples? Do you have a bit of a laundry list of some examples of those types of special needs?
There's the obvious, muscular dystrophy, Down syndrome, diabetes, asthma. The ones that I think become more problematic are ADHD, ADD, learning disabilities, and then autism spectrum disorder, which is my son's diagnosis. And that is one I am most involved in with families. And the one area that I think probably gets parents into the biggest conflict.
Very interesting, very interesting. And so, as you say, there's the obvious ones that are medically diagnosed, and then there's the other ones that there may or may not be a diagnosis, which could be part of the struggle. But at the end of the day, children with any of these unique needs and special needs, it's really important for us to pay special attention to these, and that's primarily what this interview is about. So we really appreciate your perspective, both as a lawyer, an attorney, and as a mom who has that personal knowledge of raising a child with special needs.
Thank you, Stephanie. I would say that it wasn't until I went through my own divorce when my youngest child, who's on the autism spectrum, high functioning, but on the spectrum nonetheless, was 7 years old. And during the process of mediating, it was very clear to me that his father and I did not see his needs or what it would take to raise him in a way that would meet those needs in the same way. And it was actually sitting at the table that I came to the realization that there were certain milestones and requirements that I wanted in our marital settlement agreement. Back in those days, we didn't have separate parenting plans, which today in Florida we do. But it was very clear to me that I needed to put certain parameters into that agreement for what I saw was in the best interest of my child. That doesn't mean that both parents agree what's in the best interest of the child.
But at least it's on the table and it becomes that discussion point. We'll talk a little bit later about staying out of the courtroom and the benefits that can create, especially when there's children with special needs. But let's start first, perhaps, by the importance of talking openly during the separation and divorce process, specifically about children with special needs, and why that's important.
I have 3 children. each one has very different needs, and each one is special. The issues that I address and the needs of my third child are very different from the needs of my older two children. My older two children can transition or could have transitioned pretty easily between two homes. Not that it's ever easy on children when their parents are getting divorced, but the process of moving between two homes would have been much simpler for them than for my youngest child. There are tremendous complications when you have a child with special needs, whether it's because of a wheelchair, because of the needs of a diabetic child who is insulin dependent, because of a child on the spectrum who needs a very regulated schedule, the sameness of waking up in the same bedroom, following the same schedule, eating the same way. Those kinds of issues become very significant and have to be addressed. They have to be talked about. Parents don't always agree on what those needs are. I've mediated with parents who have children on the autism spectrum who don't even agree on what it is a child likes to eat, and that creates conflict. So I always recommend that parents work through those kinds of issues, hopefully outside the process, so that when they get into the process, we can resolve the issues as opposed to arguing about them in the middle of the mediation or in the middle of a collaborative process. That typically will require a medical doctor, a psychologist, a child specialist, somebody who can be engaged with what it is your child needs in order to thrive and grow to his or her fullest potential.
And so you're talking about the importance of involving that team of professionals who can help to guide and influence the parents into making sure that each child's special and unique needs are met during the negotiation process.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that can't be done in one session of mediation or even necessarily around a collaborative table unless you have the professionals at the table who can answer the questions that need to be answered.
Absolutely. So what would a unique parenting plan look like which caters to a child with special needs? What should parents be thinking about? I always like to have in every one of my interviews sort of a top 3 tips. And if you have, what would your top 3 tips be for parents?
Well, it starts with don't litigate. I strongly believe that families with children with special needs do not belong in the courtroom. Courtrooms are not designed to deal with those special needs. The statutes, the case law, it's all written in a way that makes presumptions that don't fit the needs of families that have special needs children. The second thing is parents have to remember that this is about the needs of their child. It's not about the amount of child support that may have to be paid. It certainly can come down to the expense of meeting the needs of the child, and that becomes problematic. It becomes a negotiation. Parents don't always see what it is that's required to help that child reach his or her full potential. But those conversations are critical. And so I think that parents need to have consulted with specialists or done their research in order to try and figure out where they're going and what their goals are for their child. And finally, think about the long-term goals you have for your child. When I went through my divorce, I did not know whether my child was college bound. He was young. Nobody could answer that question. back in those days. So I tried to build into my agreement what I thought would be protection for him, whichever way it went. It turns out that we ended up in a courtroom when he actually did apply and got accepted to college. So you can't anticipate every eventuality, but you do have to think long term. There's testing that comes up along the way. There's expenses that come up along the way. There are changes in the way therapies are viewed over the years. A lot changed in the 13 years or so between the time that we went through the divorce and he reached the age that he was living independently. So you have to really try and kind of see into the future, which is very difficult for parents who are in the middle of a divorce.
So those are great tips, and we're also going to be able to have a handout that is attached below this interview that parents will be able to download, and with some of the considerations that the parents will want to be thinking about as they go through their separation and divorce negotiation. Can you talk to us just very briefly about what that handout contains?
The handout was put together by a group of us, including a financial planner, a financial neutral, a child specialist, a mental health professional, and 2 attorneys. So the handout is very extensive. It covers financial planning tips for families with children with special needs. It talks about something that I'm not sure is worldwide, but in the United States, we have guardianship issues that are imperative they be addressed at the collaborative table or in mediation. So you don't have a child who turns 18 and the parents haven't communicated well in years and all of a sudden have to make a decision about whether there's going to be a determination of incapacity and the appointment of a guardian for their child. Is there a special needs trust that's necessary for the long-term care of your child? How is the division of property or assets going to be allocated in order to take care of your child? Is there going to be more child support, a deviation from the child support guidelines in order to take care of the needs of your special needs child? So all of that's covered in the handout. And then we get into parenting plan considerations for the family. We get into support considerations for the family once you're out of the divorce process and thinking ahead to what may be necessary. So it's a very comprehensive handout. It was written really for professionals. So I think when parents read it, they need to keep in mind that these are the kinds of issues that should come up. And if the professionals that they go to don't know to ask the questions that are addressed in the handout, the parents need to ask the questions.
Yes, and so that's why we're so thankful that you're able to provide us with this handout for parents who are watching this video and who are part of our community, have resources that can help them as they go through their separation and divorce. As you mentioned, as an attorney, you and with yourself having a child with special needs, you are sought out for that skill set and that experience. But there are lots of families that will be going to professionals who don't have that kind of experience. And so that handout will not only be helpful, as you said, for families, but also for the professionals to make sure that this dialogue happens that is so critical to make sure that children's unique needs are addressed and cared for and really thought through. So thank you so much for your generosity.
Oh, it's my pleasure. A part of my practice is estate planning. Not every family attorney does estate planning, so you may need to engage the services of an estate planning attorney to be a part of the team in order to plan for the future. There are so many considerations that you don't even realize when you're sitting at the table. I sat at that table. I couldn't have even imagined back then what it would have taken. I wish that there had been something like this available to me so that I could have understood what was ahead of me.
And even if it's an overwhelming list and an overwhelming handout, it's something that can be used and shared with their professionals. So
the handout's done in a digestible way so that it's not an overwhelming document.
Yes.
And something that you can just sit and spend some time perusing and come up with some ideas about the kinds of topics you want to talk to your professionals about.
Exactly. Let's talk a little bit about scheduling for the children. Often scheduling gets lumped in together in one global plan where, there's 3 children and the 3 children will go to one parent's house at this time, and the other children, and then the children will sort of rotate homes, and the children are often lumped in together. You advocate for the need to consider each child individually, and in particular to consider siblings as well, and to create personalized time sharing plans. Can you talk about that a little bit and why it's so important?
Yeah, absolutely. I think every family needs personalized time sharing plans. Every family's needs are different. The dynamics between siblings is different. By way of example, there's a 10-year age gap between my oldest and my youngest. Clearly, the needs of my daughter, who's the oldest, were going to be very different from those of my youngest, even if he wasn't special needs. The kind of time that each of them needed with each parent was going to be very different. And then there's the middle child, who as a middle child has very different needs. In my situation, I felt that it was in my youngest child's best interest that if he was going to be with his father, that his older brother be there. I felt very strongly, and it turned out to be true, that his father didn't accept his diagnosis, didn't understand what his needs were, but I knew that his siblings did. And I felt that he would be safer if his brother was there, because his brother was very mindful of the schedule, the eating pattern, some of the behaviors that we saw day in and day out in the home that was the primary residence of the children, and the bit of time that they spent with their father. So it was actually a requirement in my agreement that my son only went, my youngest, if his older brother was going. My daughter was already old enough that we didn't address timeshare with her. That wouldn't necessarily be the case for every family. In some families, a child on the spectrum can be so demanding that that child needs some individual time with the parent, that the parent's energy needs to go into that child, and the sibling needs some individual time with the parent because they're tired. They do help care for the sibling with the special needs, and they need a break. So all of that has to be taken into consideration. Was it a burden on my middle child to know that his brother was only going if he went? Fortunately, he didn't see it that way. But in hindsight, when I think about it, it could have been a bad result for my middle child.
Yeah, that's so important to really think individually about the children, and to work within that to make sure that the family in 2 homes is able to manage the children at various children's at various homes at various times. So to find that right combination. And interestingly, that that really leads into our next question, talking about staying out of court and the importance of staying out of court, which you mentioned at the beginning of the interview, using processes like negotiation processes like collaborative divorce and mediation, where both parties are at the table and they are communicating, even through advocates or a mediator, but they are actually talking and they have that platform and that opportunity to make those kind of individualized plans. Can you talk a little bit about your why you think staying out of court is so critical for families, especially those families with special needs or with children with special needs?
With pleasure. I do want to say one other thing. I completely understand that parents need a break too.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes I see in some of my cases that a parent will take a position. You have to take both kids, you have to take all three kids. I need a break. I need some time to myself.
Mm-hmm.
That's all well and good, but perhaps there's another way to deal with it so that if all three children or two children really can't go to the other parent's home at the same time for all the reasons I covered earlier, that we figure out a way to create a break for the other parent to allow for some time to themselves when they're not a caregiver for the child.
Mm-hmm.
Don't put the other parent in the position of having to take both or all three or whatever the number of children are, so that we're creating the kind of problems that I talked about earlier.
Mm-hmm.
As to what process parents choose, I had been collaboratively trained back at the time that I went through my divorce. It didn't occur to me to use collaborative. Fortunately, we went straight into mediation. But I really believe had we been in the collaborative process and engaged the kinds of professionals that I talked about earlier, we might have had a very different outcome. Because we didn't do that, because we didn't have these kinds of conversations, every expenditure, every therapist, every decision that had to be made over the next 13 years for my son became a problem. And we ended up back in court when he was admitted to college, and his father filed a motion saying that his early admission to college was evidence of his no longer being on the autism spectrum. In a 10-minute hearing, the judge ruled in his favor and terminated my child support, even though the child support under the agreement was supposed to have continued to age 21, even if he went to college, because I knew that he would need extra support. He might need tutoring, he might need counseling, he might need therapies, particularly if he was living away from home and having to adapt to something new. It was so shocking to me that a judge could rule that way without having any background, any information, any diagnosis, that I walked out of court that day and looked at my partner who was representing me and said, I will never, ever go back to court again. And it was at that point that I committed myself to the collaborative process, to mediating for families with special needs children. That is the only place that you can really resolve issues when your child has special needs. The courtroom can't do it. The judges don't have time. The judges don't understand. The law doesn't necessarily allow for the kinds of options and differences between our children that we've been talking about. And you're not going to get the outcome that works best for your family or works best for your children, especially the child with special needs, in a courtroom. It's got to be done sitting at a table where you can have an honest conversation about what your children, all of them, but especially the one with special needs to thrive and grow to his or her fullest potential.
Yes. And that's partly why we're so thankful for that handout that we've got attached to this interview, because it really helps to start that conversation, whether the parents know to ask these questions or whether the professionals know to bring these kind of questions into the negotiation. At least the questions get on the table, so we don't have to try to think up all of these things and what kinds of things should we be considering when we're at the negotiations table. So we're very thankful for that, because it is the conversation that's so important.
And I think part of what happens, especially in the early years of a diagnosis with something like autism, you're not thinking in terms of your child's long-term potential because nobody knows what that is. Truly, nobody knows what that potential is. It takes years and years to get to the point where I received a phone call when he was in 5th grade, and his principal said to me, "Your son will go to college." And I remember just sitting there crying, looking at the phone, thinking, oh my God, it was not even something that I had hoped for, much less thought about. So when you don't know these things, there's so much planning and conversation that has to go into it because you simply don't know. It's easy when you have typically developing children to sit at the table and talk about who's going to pay for college, who's going to pay for tutoring, who's going to pay for what we know to be the typical needs of our children. But when you're talking about a child with special needs, virtually everything is unknown other than the fact that therapy is going to be needed, intervention is going to be needed, support is going to be needed.
And that's interesting. Let's talk a little bit more about the kinds of supports that parents should be looking for both themselves and for their children with special needs as they're transitioning into 2 homes.
I'm going to reference back to autism spectrum disorder because that's what I know best. And the spectrum is so wide that, as one of my son's principals once said to me, if you've met one child on the autism spectrum disorder, you've met one child. No 2 children are the same. The one thing I learned about it is that parents are very reluctant to talk about their children with autism for whatever reason. You need to talk about it. You need to get support. You need to be around other families going through the same thing. You may need therapy yourself to deal with the stress of what you're going through, because the financial demands of taking care of your child are tremendous. The physical demands are tremendous. The time demands are tremendous. The siblings need support. They need an outlet to talk about what's happening at home, in addition to what's happening in terms of the divorce. Being a sibling to a child with special needs comes with its own stress that we don't always recognize as being put on the siblings. Clergy, teachers, therapists, neighbors, community members. My children were raised by a village. Had it not been for the community that we lived in and the people that loved my children and understood really each of them and what they needed, I'm not sure they would have turned out the way they did, because I couldn't have done it myself.
Yeah. And so that brings up the idea of how important it is to have those open conversations so that you can access these resources and really make sure that you're getting what you need and that your children are getting what they need. And that first starts with that dialogue and the conversation, and making sure that that's on the table and everyone's open about it.
Right. And it was very interesting. My son went to a school for children with special needs, which happened to be on the same campus as the Jewish day school that my older children went to. So he had no idea that he wasn't enrolled in the same school that they were at. He was wearing the same uniform, being dropped off at the same location. But I always said to the school he was at, when you get new parents that are looking at the school or enrolling in the school, please give them my number. I'm happy to talk to any parent. I was always very open about my son's diagnosis and needs. In the 13 or 14 years I was in the school, I never got one phone call. And I would go to the annual dinner. I would run into people that I knew, but had no idea that they were in the school. I talked about in our presentation where the handout came from, that families, and again, I'm going to reference families with children on the spectrum, kind of live in the pockets of society. They're almost hidden. I think a lot of it is because of the financial and emotional stress of raising a child on the spectrum. Other diagnoses come with their own stresses. I know families that have children with childhood diabetes that deal with tremendous stress. There's so many other learning disabilities that comes with its own stress. But something like diabetes, parents are more open about. Maybe because it's a physical need as opposed to some other need that is a behavioral issue, because your child has a breakdown when you take him or her into the grocery store and the lights are overwhelming and the smells are overwhelming and the sounds are just more than they can handle. So parents tend to be very quiet about their children. From my perspective, it's not a healthy way to live, because you really need the people around you, and especially other parents going through it, to support you.
Absolutely. And that's part of the reason that I was so intrigued by you and I doing this interview, is because I did see the presentation that you're referring to, and I really wanted to have you within our community as one of our contributors, because it is such an important conversation, and all of the things that you've talked about today are so important for families who are separating or divorcing to really start to think about and to normalize. And that's what you're doing, and you're doing such an amazing job with that. And I thank you for bringing your voice to our community. It's so great having you, Rebecca.
Thank you, Stephanie. And thank you for giving me an opportunity to talk about it, because I've learned so much from my son. And I didn't get to this place by accident. Again, it was because of the teachers he had, the therapists he had, the community that we lived in. But no parent should have to go through it alone, and no divorcing family should have to go through it alone. The divorce rate among families with special needs children is significantly higher than the divorce rate in families that don't have special needs children. I believe that part of the reason for that is because of the financial and emotional and physical toll that is put on families in trying to deal with all the issues that we just talked about. And you need support. You need support to get through it when your family dynamic is healthy, and you need support to get through it when your family is falling apart.
And to have those rights, the professionals who understand that and who are going to support your family in the right way is so critical. And that's part of the basis for our e-learning community, is to have one central place for all sorts of information around separation and divorce, but all that focuses on supporting and empowering families so that they can thrive when they're in two homes. And so thank you again so much for joining us, and your interview will live on in our e-learning community forevermore. So thank you again, Rebecca.
Thank you.